Dr. Mutter, but she's entrusted me with chairing this session. I suppose my claim to do so is that I'm a quite near neighbour of Lynn's in the distinguished suburb of Dundas, not too far from here. Lynn's PhD was published as a book with the title of Saving Shipwrecked Men, and it concerns, in broad outline, 1 Timothy. Since then, Lynn Kidson has devoted herself to teaching in Parramatta at Alpha Crucis College. There's much more published work since her book, and she's got responsibility at SBL conferences for the shared responsibility for the disputed Paulines. So if you want to speak to a great international conference about the disputed Paulines, this is who to talk to. There's an update, a latest emendation of the title, which I understand now is Paul's stay in Ephesus and his mission strategy in Asia, which is not exactly the same wording as you have on the screen or in the booklet. So, Lynn.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I'm sorry. Maybe I was a little too ambitious before I could achieve in one conference paper. So I just had to narrow down what we're doing. So we're looking at Paul's missionary strategy. Because at the end of his letter in 1 Corinthians, Paul outlines his travel plans. He tells the Corinthians that he does not want to make only a passing visit, but wants to stay with you a while or even spend the winter. That's in chapter 16, verse 6. His plan is to travel through Macedonia after he leaves Ephesus. But in the meantime, he says he plans to stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost because a great door, megale, for effective work has opened to me. And my question is, why might Paul have enjoyed success in Ephesus? So Paul describes his success by using a metaphor. A great door has opened to me. And this has resulted in effective work for him. A metaphor can refer to an underlying social reality. Paul is using the metaphor to sum up what would be a long and detailed narrative. It must draw on a shared analogy between Paul and his Corinthian audience for this brief note to act as an excuse for Paul's delay in visiting them. While the Corinthians do not know the detail of Paul's activity, they nonetheless are able to visualise the general nature of that activity through the use of his metaphor, a great door. Without any extra information from Paul about this, it would seem that the Corinthians' own experience is forming their gap of the metaphor. The use of door is a familiar metaphor associated in philosophical and New Testament literature with the soul. But here in Corinthians, he's not doing that. He's saying it's a great door of effective work. So I propose that the door is an analogy for the door of houses he is doing this effective work in. This is described in Acts, in Paul's speech to the Ephesians elders in Miletus. He says, I did not shrink from doing anything helpful, proclaiming the message to you and teaching you publicly from house to house, as I testified to both Jews and Greeks about repentance towards God and faith in our Lord Jesus. Sorry, there you go. I have to jump over some thoughts I have here on metaphor, but in summary, I'd like to propose that Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians that he has a great opportunity to preach to many in Asia by being welcomed through many doors. In other words, he is referring to himself as an invited guest who teaches in many houses. What I am suggesting is a situation that is analogous to Paul's mission in Corinth as described by Adam White in his article, Servants Not Intellectual Clients. Paul's opportunity to enter into a household and teach not only to the household residents, but also the friends and clients associated with that household came about because of Roman patronage system. From the late Republican era, private Roman houses became the setting for intellectual discussion. Along with this passion for intellectual pursuit, there developed a culture where the householder would become a patron to a visiting orator, philosopher, or poet. These people not only gave demonstrations of their art form, but would also instruct. Such a position in a household could be as a friend who received benefits, which blurred into what could be considered a salaried position. For Lucian, a paid position as an intellectual client was nothing short of being enslaved. To be paid for such work was for Lucian summed up in the maxim, where gain is, be a slave beyond your nature. However, a household intellectual might not receive a wage, as Lucian describes, but they could be a friend of their patron. Such a position, says Adam White, was ambiguous. Yes. Despite the ability of a literary friend to reciprocate gifts, and the fact that it was a relationship between members of the socio-economic upper class, it remained a friendship between two parties of unequal wealth and status. Peter White summarises the relationship in the following terms. The relationship between posts and their prominent friends looked no different from a mass of other relationships in upper class society, which presented subtly compounded elements of parity and inequality. All alike go by the name of friendship. Adam White sums up this situation by saying, despite the intimacy that the two parties often shared, the literary friend was always in greater need of the other's resources and reputation. Paul's situation in Corinth became complicated because he had refused the offer of patronage, but Apollos had not. This led to the perception that Paul spurned the offer of friendship from a particular patron, while Apollos had accepted it. At this point, White makes an important proposal. The patron of Apollos was most likely the head of the Apollos faction. In other words, the social authority rested with the householder and patron, not with the teacher, just by the virtue of his teaching position. Thus, argues White, Paul had to utilise a metaphor to shape the situation away from the expected one, in that the patron held the social authority. White argues that Paul wants the leader of the Apollos faction to see him as the overseer in a household. This is how one should regard us, says Paul, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Oikomonos, mysterion theou. This is because Paul, says White, if he took the offer of patronage, he would become an intellectual client, beholding to his master like a slave, always needing to cajole him. Whereas if he refused the offer, he would be free to continue to preach as one entrusted with a stewardship from God. White argues, by choosing to style himself as a steward, Paul is in the social position to select teachers and oversee their teaching as a steward does in a household that has intellectual clients, as Lucian describes. The intellectual client must also impress the steward as well as the patron's attorney. And then you, the intellectual client, in order to be paid, must flatter and wheedle the master and pay court to his steward. The intellectual client must not only continue to impress the patron, steward and attorney, but also his wife, his friend and his friends. In other words, nearly all those associated with the household have the right to judge the performance of the intellectual client. You can see why Paul's not very keen about this idea. However, Paul argues that his status as an apostle puts him beyond the need to pay court to a patron and his household, which includes his slaves. Since God's steward, God's steward, he is only judged by God on the basis of the performance of his duties. I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness and will disclose the purposes of the heart. Then each one will receive commendation from God. Later, he goes on in 1 Corinthians to defend his right to material aid because the church is the result of his work as an apostle, as we heard in the last paper. As an apostle, he is free to conduct his work, which he styles in 1 Corinthians 4 as the steward of the Lord. And this gives us some insight into a great door has opened in Ephesus. Paul is not just an orator or a sophist visiting house to house. Rather, he represents God, which is the key idea behind the term apostle, who is performing the duties of a steward. This certainly is how the writer of 1 Timothy pictures Paul's activity in Ephesus. Paul was appointed into service by the Lord because he was judged faithful in 1 Timothy 1:12, and he is an example in 1 Timothy 1:16. He's an example of what he is commanding the certain people to do when he says, rather, they are to pursue the stewardship of God, oikoian theou. That's in verses 3 to 4. This stewardship can involve striving in oration and in the instruction, as it says in 1 Timothy 5:17, which in chapter 1, verse 10, conforms to the glorious gospel which was entrusted to Paul. However, this stewardship would seem to involve more than just oration, but is also the implementation of, in practical terms, of the instructions set out in the letter. The stewardship in 1 Timothy seems to be the special activity of overseers, deacons, and elders. The practical element of this stewardship can be seen in the description of the ideal overseer in 1 Timothy 3:1-7. In 1 Timothy 3:5, the overseer must be able to manage his own household if he is to take care of the church of God. The overseer of 1 Timothy 3 is to care for the church in the same personal manner as he would care for his own family and household. In taking care of the church, he would be fulfilling the aim of the letter, which is the love, which is 1 Timothy 1:5. The role of the overseer is to ensure that everyone's needs are taken care of, just as if they were members of his household. The ability to teach is an important quality in an overseer, but it is not his prime concern, as the well-being of the community is his focus. Other elders speak and teach, for this they are given a double honour, but it is not the whole of their role in the church, nor does it make them qualified to be an elder or an overseer. If these people are examples of Paul's service, then it gives us an insight into Paul's activity in Ephesus at the time that he was writing 1 Corinthians. So I'm going to assume that Paul's metaphor, a great door, actually means many doors have opened to him in his stay in Ephesus. But as he argues in 1 Corinthians, he is not visiting each house as a paid guest. Certainly, he is not seeking to enter into a relationship with a patron, settling in one household to conduct his intellectual activities. As an apostle, his service is to represent the King of Ages, as it says in 1 Timothy 1:17, and to ensure that the church, the household of God, is managed well, as we saw before. Therefore, into whose homes would he be bringing this message as an apostle? In 1 Corinthians 9, he believes an obligation has been laid on him to proclaim the gospel. He makes his proclamation free of charge so as not to be entangled in the patronage system. He does this to establish new churches like in Corinth. I propose that he's using the same strategy in Ephesus. It may be that he is being supported, as he describes in 1 Corinthians 9, getting his living by the gospel, that's in verse 14, without the entanglements of patronage as has been offered in Corinth. Potentially a great door is opened in Ephesus because he has not had to earn his own living as he did in Corinth. He describes this scenario at the end of 1 Corinthians. I urge you to put yourselves at the service of such people, those devoted to the service of the saints, and of everyone who works and toils with them. That's 16:16. Perhaps Priscilla and Aquila and their church are supporting Paul in Ephesus, as he has just described. Just after this, he sends greetings from Priscilla and Aquila and the church that meets in their house. Other churches may have freely supported Paul, just as the Macedonians did while he was in Corinth. Oh, come on. Bradley Billings, in his article on the housing and social networks of the early church in Ephesus, describes a situation where the vast majority of Christian communities shared the utter poverty that was the lot of the overwhelming number of their compatriots. Anyway, I'll say a bit more that later. He concludes using a social network theory that groups exist in this urban environment by cohering around a common familial, ethnic, commercial or religious anchor, often presided over a paterfamilias-like figure who performed the role of patriarch and leader. Among the Christian converts of cities like Ephesus and Corinth, the Apostle Paul, resident in each place for considerable amounts of time, would have fulfilled this role. While I think that social network theory has a lot to offer in considering the missional work of Paul, I don't think his model involved him being a paterfamilias-like figure. Rather, the central figure of each church group would have been the one who owned or rented the door through which Paul brought his message instruction on how to care for the church that met in their home. In Corinth, we see a house church gathered around Stephanas, and in Ephesus, there is one gathered around in the house of Aquila and Priscilla. That Priscilla and Aquila travelled to Ephesus, perhaps to aid Paul in his mission, suggests that they rented a property. What was this property? Was it a workshop, a tenement, or a domus? Whatever type of property, the physical spaces of ancient domestic architecture are constrained. The ethos that Paul is building is a network of supporting household groups, as suggested in the greeting. The churches of Asia send their greetings. Paul sees the churches acting together with one voice to send greetings to the multiple house groups in Corinth. Paul's work perhaps was not just in Ephesus, the city as we know it, but also in the towns and villages that existed on the coast and up the Kidson Valley. What doors lay in the region around Ephesus? How far afield did Paul's mission work extend to be able to say the churches of Asia? J.W. Hanson describes how the density of towns and cities along the western seaboard of Asia Minor boomed in the early imperial period. Dense road and river systems connected these centres to one another. Possibilities abound for connections, not just in Ephesus, but in other towns and cities which were only a day's journey away. If we consider Paul's use of social networks to move from door to door, city to city, what available networks did he have? He gives some insight in chapter 9 when he says, 1 Corinthians, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. In other words, it's to Jews and Gentiles. His pattern, as it is described in Acts, is to go to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles. The evidence firmly points to a Jewish community in Ephesus in the 1st century. Further, we know that the Jewish community in Asia was a prosperous one. So we're not talking about people who are dirt poor. The domiciles that Paul was visiting were unlikely to be those of the poor, but well-to-do Jewish families with social and business connections to non-Jewish households. Like in Corinth, Paul was able to move from household to household, proclaiming the good news, but adjusting his message and his demeanour, whether the household was Jewish or Gentile. If we consider Paul's mission work from a network point of view, possibilities become apparent. Richard Last proposes a neighbourhood model of church affiliation in Corinth. Using Billings' work, who builds on Wallace Hadrill's insight that neighbours in city blocks, tenement buildings and large dormers would have forged a strong sense of community. These organised groups formed out of neighbourhood-based social relationships would include not only familiar links, but also ethnic, commercial and cultic ties also. The formation of associates devoted to Christ most likely led to the occupation of individual insular and even whole city blocks and areas, using as a basis for consolidation and further expansion. Last point is not that it was individual households forming the first Christ groups, but they incorporated individuals from their networks in their neighbourhoods. Similarly, Wendt makes the case that associates acting on Paul's behalf cultivated those who had received or would receive his teachings. We could imagine this kind of scenario in densely populated Ephesus. I would like to propose that the question is, how did Jewish households establish social networks with Gentiles? How did Paul move from a Jewish social network to a Gentile social network? These are difficult questions to answer because there seems to be an assumption that Jewish people lived in a ghetto, distanced from their social and cultural world, as Jonathan said. Smith complains. Some scholars seem to assume that Paul recruited Gentile converts through the public preaching in the hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus, but this may have only played a small part in Paul's missionary success. Kloppenberg makes an astute observation. Recruitment, moreover, is based on much less on the appeal of popular ideas that the group espouses and much more on friendships, effective relationships and trust. Kloppenberg argues that recruitment is a function of two variables. One, network structure, and two, ecology of the elective cult. Networks, he says, make available information, influence and ideas, and depending on the structure of the network, allow for the introduction of new ideas, or they could also resist innovation. While the ecology of each cult refers to its characteristics and what it needed to flourish, it influences the ways in which the cult can diffuse and create conditions for the movement of new ideas through networks, and the ecologies of some cults may make that diffusion difficult. What I'm probing at here are the conditions of Judaism in Asia Minor that allow for networks with Gentiles and give potential for Jews to create an ecology in a Christ group that allowed for a flourishing of mixed ethnic groups. There are two possibilities that I can see which aided Paul's great door. First, Jewish folks had established business networks with Gentiles that allowed for collegiality, which provided a template for the ecology of the new association of Christ groups. The most likely option is coming together of people in guilds. Guilds made their own rules, so they very easily could make accommodation for Jewish members and their specific requirements. There's clear evidence that Jews could eat with Gentiles as long as distinctions were made between Gentile and Jewish food and drink, or banquets were prepared with Jewish sensibilities in mind. It would be difficult for Jewish families to undertake business without belonging to a guild and work collaboratively with Gentile business associates. So I think Richard Last is right when he argues that some craft guilds devoted to the Judean deity recruited their members from local populations of tradesmen, carpet weavers, bakers, goldsmiths. They could be and often were culturally homogenous. We could also take into account that in Asia Minor, Jews were respected and positive contributors to their towns and cities, but that the synagogue may have had barriers to participation for the interested Gentile. A sect of Judaism that allowed greater freedom of association like a guild may have had its attractions. Secondly, Paul's willingness to compromise in 1 Corinthians 9:21 was not unique. It could be that he made use of the collegiality in guilds in which Jews and Gentiles met to build trust in order to preach his gospel to both Jews and Gentiles. The epitaph of P. Aurelius Glycon and his wife Aurelia Amia of Hierapolis is helpful here. This couple left the foundation for the guilds of the purple dyers and the carpet weavers to honour their graves during the Roman festival Calends and the Jewish festivals of Passover and Pentecost. Although nearly every aspect of this inscription is contested, I think it makes sense in the light of the God-fearers in the synagogue in Aphrodisia, not too far away, to see this epitaph as belonging to a relational space where Jews and Gentiles associated collegially. Potential connections through trusted business associates provides a neat solution, I think, and I hope I persuaded you, to Paul's great door that opened out into Asia and allowed him to step into both Gentile and Jewish households.
All right, so questions. Who's first? Don't be shy.
Anyone?
Yes, there are.
You convinced me, Lynn. Could I just ask, is there more evidence about these guild networks having a cultic or religious element to them?
Oh, the guild, yes.
Yeah.
Usually the guild is, there's like patron god or goddess. So, yeah, that's last idea is that I think I've got that right, that there might have been predominantly Jewish guilds with Yahweh as the patron god. But we don't know if that for sure. That's just a suggestion from him. But somehow we've got to get Jews and Gentiles together, right? Otherwise what Paul's doing can't happen.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Lynn. I got stuck on door. So as is my want. Did you pursue any sense of the use of that metaphor door in Ephesus, or for like you made it into many doors, but why is the importance of that door, and is it just an opportunity, or is it in other
Yeah, so okay, so I am pushing the boundary a little, but if I had more time I would have quoted do I have it here? About the opportunity. It kind of meant like an opportunity to do something, which is probably closer to the sense. I was just playing with the word a little. But because he is, the only way I can see that he's doing this, like to the churches in Asia, like is he finding a hall of Tyrannus in every single, like how feasible is that in every single city? Or is it more feasible that he would just visit the homes of people and they have a little soiree and he speaks to their friends and clients and other family members. So, yeah, I am pushing things there, and Larry picked me up on that as well, Rosemary. So I don't quite know what to do, but if you got any ideas? I would love to hear them, how I get from talking about the great door to what actually means in reality as I started. Yeah. Oh, I did. I went thoroughly through, and which is why I said at the beginning, like, it's mostly used in the New Testament to mean like it's sort of like associated to your soul, but it's also used in philosophical literature to mean that as well. So, having the door open to things is, like usually it involves some sort of not so good influence on your life. Yeah. But physically, Paul's talking about some sort of other thing other than person's personal character or life.
I agree that there was a lot of cooperation between Jews and Gentiles in certain areas. Have you had a look at what was going on in Alexandria and Antioch? I mean, Alexandria had the biggest Jewish community outside of Israel. And in Alexandria, you had a situation also when they later developed in Alexandria quite a bit Christian supporters. But the Jews and Gentiles were getting together. In fact, Philo of Alexandria, one of the great philosophers,
Yes.
actually took a delegation to the emperor, the Roman emperor, including Gentiles and Jews, about what was happening to the city of Alexandria, the taxes and all the rest.
Yes.
So there was clearly significant cooperation in those areas, and I think that would have rebounded in Asia Minor, especially in Antioch.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to look at that.
Yeah. So I did think about that, but my reluctance to go there was that you could argue, though, like if I was going to write this in an article, I can see a reviewer saying, oh, but it's like a different cultural situation in Alexandria, and then I'd have to try and argue that there was how the situation in Alexandria was going to be the same in Asia. I don't know. What do you think about that, Paul?
I think it's hard to prove either way.
Yeah. So I've already gone out on the limb a little. But you're right. So the point about the cooperation in the embassy, the guys, that is a good point. I hadn't actually noted that. So perhaps I could use that as a some supporting evidence. So thank you for that.
I have a question, if I may abuse my position in the chair. When Paul was sentenced to 39 lashes, which happened more than once, what was the offence? What was he charged with?
I don't know. We don't know, do we?
No.
No.
But
yeah.
all right. Someone will correct me if I've remembered this wrong. But in the Bible, in the law of Moses, the things you can be sentenced to that for are sex with the wrong person, fornication, getting a tattoo, or eating with Gentiles, or associating with Gentiles. Now, would I be silly to assume that? Would I be silly to assume that it was unlikely that he was convicted of
the
getting
first
a
two,
tattoo
yes.
or of a sex crime?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. That's a good point.
So I think it's probable, therefore, that he was, and this wasn't a civil punishment, you see, so in the sense of Roman law, the Jews didn't have a right to inflict this.
Yeah, no, I've read the stuff about it being a synagogue. Yeah. Punishment.
But he, you know, took it like a Jewish gentleman. And was it 5 times? So if he was sentenced to 39 lashes for associating with Gentiles, and this happened 5 times. That means he kept on associating with Gentiles, doesn't it?
So, oh, I was going to ask a question back. So, do you think that's the reason why Peter's reluctant in Galatians to continue eating with the Gentiles? Anyway, somebody else probably wants to answer.
Might be. I mean, that can be regarded as an inconsistency in him after the Cornelius vision, can't it?
Right. Stella?
Why would Paul be punished for having meals with Gentiles when he's a Roman citizen?
That's a good question. So there are ways that we've got evidence. Now, I did collect evidence about this, about Jews eating with Gentiles. So you could associate with Gentiles, but maybe he's going a step beyond what's acceptable. So this whole idea of incorporating Gentiles into into the body of into the structure of Jewish, as he does in Romans, maybe that's what he's getting. I don't know. What do you think, Paul? Maybe it's more than just the eating with, because it seems to me that they might have, like I was arguing, they're probably eating in the guilds together with other Gentiles. It's just somehow they've worked out how to keep the two apart.
Yes, yes. And if at your guild dinner, where half of us are Jews and half of us are Gentiles, everyone was upset.
Yes. So Daniel, that's what Daniel does and his companions, right? They don't eat the meat that's sacrificed to the idols. They have a vegetarian.
If everyone in the guild knows that's okay, and
Yep.
that doesn't necessarily mean everyone in the synagogue. This is going to look at it that way.
Right.
Because in the synagogue, they're not all level workers or whatever.
Yes.
Your guild.
So the problem is it's so much we don't know.
Lynn, thank you. It's obviously opened up great conversation on this. I'm reminded of 2 things. Firstly, there was a woman some years ago at SBL who pointed out that the general understanding of the ghettoization of Jews in Rome was built on the aggregation in the 1600s of Jewish stuff into particular areas, and they formed a ghetto. And that has led
Yes.
to this understanding. And the epitaphs throughout the world that can be identified as having one or other Jewish elements are so mixed. They have Greek names, Roman names, Jewish names, and there's a real sense that, particularly when you've got, say, the woman with citizenship but the husband not, that there's a real blending going on, that maybe John Barclay's understanding of the huge variegation in Jewish identity across the Mediterranean needs to be taken into account here, not just the particular terms of the law that are promoted by the local synagogue.
Yes. So it's right, and I've quoted Barclay in here. But the question is now, Alan, like we were talking about, why did Paul get flogged for doing the thing that everyone else is doing? Associating with Gentiles. Hey, anyway. Oh, Craig at the back.
There's a lot of evidence that under the Roman legal system, they allowed the Jews to apply their own law, even in the regions, which could explain why Paul received it. But the other question that comes to mind is, why did he submit to it when he didn't have to?
Yes, because he says in Corinthians, as I read out, I'm not under the law. So that's right. He doesn't feel like he needs to be under the law, but he's submitting to the punishment anyway. What we need is Paul here. Oh, thank you.
So I've got a question
Maggie.
about your just your last point about using the guild networks within the city to reach out to both Jews and Gentiles, do you reckon that might also be a thing that Paul used throughout the greater Asia Minor area, where someone from a guild in one city would like recommend him to a guild in another city and like write letters to them saying, hey, this Paul guy's coming, isn't he great? Invite him to your house and he'll talk and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So, you know, the set conference before last, I looked at Lydia, and that's one of the things I said was, I tried to point out was that, yeah, there's the networks of tradespeople isn't just in their city, but it extends across the across the empire, or you know, if you're in the east, across the eastern part of the empire, because you have to source various materials to be able to, you know, if you're making chandeliers or something like that, or you're a person produces, like I was looking at the textile industry, you know, there's so many different moving parts to like making a dress like it is today, that you have to source various materials. And so you have, and if you want to make the best quality, then you have representatives where you can source the best quality materials. So you have these networks that extend across the Mediterranean. So yes, Penny, I think that's exactly what Paul is doing. So letter of recommendation in his pocket, and off he goes to the next city because he's been recommended by particular person X, Y, or Z. That's how you get to stay. Somebody had a letter of Michael had a letter of recommendation, which explains, it illustrates very nicely how it worked.
Time for one more, I think, if someone's got one. I need one. Oh.
This quotation you've got here made me wonder, thanks, this quotation you've got make me wonder what sort of distinctions might have been made between God-fearers and Jews. Obviously, it's easy to tell for men, isn't it? But what sorts of distinctions might hold? Would they be held in some way to be almost Jews or kind of acceptable, but not having taken the final step and so on? Just when it says they're culturally heterogeneous, I did wonder where God-fearers fitted in there.
I know. So the problem is, we have like, is it 3rd century, 4th century inscriptions that talk about God-fearers, but then before that, the evidence is in Acts, where Luke talks about God-fearers. So, don't know. Here's the answer.
Look, that's an honest note to end on. Thank you very much.